So we've been looking at the Dharma through symbols and stories, and specifically for a while we've been looking at the system of the stages of the spiritual path, or the system of spiritual practice that Sangha Night outlined. And we've been looking at this first aspect, integration. Integration meaning bringing all the different parts of us together so that they're all pulling in the same direction, so that we've not got different urges going in different directions, so that there aren't parts of ourselves that we're not aware of that pull us off course all the time. It's about becoming a whole person with the different parts of ourselves in harmony, working together to achieve what we want to achieve, to be what we want to be. Becoming a whole person. And the last few talks we've had, we've been looking at, owning up to and, as it were, befriending those parts of ourselves that we'd rather pretend didn't exist. Becoming aware, accepting these perhaps slightly less sociable sides of ourselves, getting them on the side of our higher inspiration. So we have all, if you think this doesn't apply to you, come and see me afterwards, okay? But I reckon we've all got anger, some subset, some sort of smorgasbord from the menu of anger, competitiveness, jealousy, resentment, greed, and desires we'd rather not advertise. And if we try to pretend that these aren't there, they can rule us. They can rule us from the shadows. Like the person who says, well, I'm not angry, but every word they say is sort of bitter and critical. All their judgments are critical, etc., etc. If we try to pretend that these urges aren't there, they rule us from the shadows. As I said in the talk about the Lapton worm, if we throw them down the well, they just grow bigger and bigger, and then they ravage our countryside. They undermine us and they grow. If we become aware of them, we start to have a choice. We start to have a choice about whether we respond to them. And we get a choice about whether we put energy into them. And we can transform them. We can begin to transform them ultimately. We can get them on our side. Use the tremendous energy that's bound up in these sort of lower drives, if you like, for skillful purposes. Excuse me, it's distracting me having an open door. Feng shui's all wrong. Cheese going out the door or something. So yeah, last week Bodhinaga talked about the symbols that of beings who are half human, half animal. We've got judgment, we've got an aesthetic sense, we've got a sense of ethics, we've got empathy with others, we've got higher ideals. But compared to an animal like a horse or a lion, we're very lacking in strength, power, energy. And as Bodhinaga describes, symbols like the centaur, part horse, part human, or he mentioned the manticore, part lion, part human, they represent the integration of, if you like, the higher human part of ourselves with the tremendous strength and energy and power of the animal part. So using the metaphor of height, if you like, Bodhinaga talked about befriending our depths, integrating our depths, getting our depths on our side. And in this talk, I'm going to talk about befriending our heights, still using that metaphor of depths. Because it's not just the coarser energies of our animal nature that we try to ignore, that we try to pretend aren't there. We also often ignore our heights. We're often out of touch with what's best and highest in us, our spiritual aspirations, our desire to move in a positive spiritual direction, our vision. So, yeah, in the earliest days of psychoanalysis, one of the big sort of insights, in a way, was this idea of the unconscious, or the subconscious. The idea that we're not aware of a lot that goes on in us. We're not aware of a lot that goes on in our own hearts and minds. And what we're not aware of rules us, can rule us from the shadows. What's not in consciousness can rule us from the shadows. And the most famous of the early psychoanalysts was Freud. And Freud portrayed the unconscious as a sort of pit filled with all the urges and desires that are so unacceptable in our family and our society that we can't own up to all that sort of grungy animal stuff that I'm not doing that. So we pretend it's not there, and so we can't deal with it. And it all too often undermines and sabotages us in all sorts of ways, poisons our mental world. So that was very much Freud's take on the unconscious. It was where this horrible stuff was, really. But his colleague Jung pointed out that it's not only those coarser, uglier bits that we push down and ignore. Often we do the same with what's best in us. And he talked about what he called the repression of the divine. The repression of the divine. Our higher spiritual aspects, our sense of ourselves as a spiritual being, with a spiritual destiny, may also not be acceptable in our family and our society, among our peers, or at school, or among our colleagues at work. If we start talking about the Buddhism, our Buddhism, for example, at work, we might, he's a bit strange chap, Convention tells us that life is about getting on, having a career, getting property, having security, having status, and so on. And if we question this, and if we talk about a desire to live out of a more spiritual vision, we're probably branded a bit weird, or even a bit mad. It's unrealistic. Be down to earth, be realistic. And the language we use often expresses this. So the word idealistic gets used as a sort of criticism. Oh, that's very idealistic. It means unrealistic. Idealistic gets comes to mean unrealistic. Oh, that's just youthful idealism. Just youthful idealism. Youthful idealism is 10 times better than mature cynicism. Supposedly mature cynicism. We talk about a do-gooder. He's a do-gooder. That's supposed to be bad. I suppose it's supposed to be good to be a do-badder. A do-gooder, so it's bad to give some sort of priority to help others. That makes you a do-gooder, and that's a bad thing. Better to be just out for yourself. It's not normal. Just concerned with your own well-being and your immediate family. So to be altruistic, to be ethical is weird. And to live out a spiritual vision, or talk about a spiritual vision, is very, very weird indeed. So we don't do it. So all too often we ignore the promptings of what's highest in us. We ignore it, and we get cut off from what is highest and best in ourselves. So we all build, and then we build this image of ourselves in our own minds. We build this image of ourselves in our own mind that isn't true to our real potential. Or we get cut off from our true potential, and we stop seeing ourselves as spiritual beings and start seeing ourselves as another wage earner and a cog in the machine, if we're not careful. We're often much more in contact with our heights in childhood and youth. We might remember times in our childhood when we've been really sort of in contact with beauty and wonder, when the world is just, our image of our vision of the world just opened up in some way, and we've seen it more as it is, full of sort of beauty and wonder. We experience moments when things brighten up. We may remember times when we had this really strong desire to be more than the sort of conventional person that we were sort of encouraged to be, to make the world a better place. Most of us had quite strong idealistic yearnings in our youth. But then we can lose our connection with that. We can lose it because it's not what we're told to be. It's not acceptable. We ignore it. And according to Jung, that is responsible for an awful lot of mental illness, actually. I can't remember exact words, but he said an awful lot of mental illness is in fact a spiritual illness. It's to do with the fact that we get cut off from what gives our life real meaning, from what's best in ourselves. So to be an integrated whole being, we need not just to befriend our depths, our animal strength, we also need to get in touch with our heights. We need to learn to listen to what is best in ourselves, open up to our potential, to be a magnificent, admirable, beautiful being. How scary. We don't do that, do we? So tonight I'd like to tell a story that illustrates this. So we're looking at the Dharma through symbols and stories, and tonight I'd like to tell a story that illustrates this. It's one of a class of stories that Sangha calls the return journey. So we've lost touch with who we really are, the admirable, rich being we could be, that we were in touch with maybe in childhood. And the return journey is the story of how we return to who, in a sense, we really are. How we make our way back to being who we really are before we thought that wasn't acceptable. So return journeys are often about exile. The stories of return journeys are often about exile. Often they involve a being from or a citizen of a higher land, a more civilized, a beautiful land, a place of beauty and nobility and harmony, who's exiled somewhere rough and crude and nasty. And they're exiled, they're there to do a task, but they're there so long they forget who they really are. They forget who they really are. And they start acting like the primitive citizens of the country they're in. They forget where they really come from. And then something happens to make them remember who they really are and where they really come from. And that they're not supposed to be just fitting in with the barbarous land they live in. And they need to make that return journey back to their true homeland, their true land. Examples of that return journey myth crop up in spiritual traditions all over the place, in many, many different spiritual traditions, because they illustrate something that's universal. They illustrate the fact that we can get cut off from what's highest in us, our true nature, and we need to find our way back to it. We need to remember who we really are, at least who we really could be. We need to reconnect with our heights and integrate our heights as well as our depths. So the version of the return journey story that I'm going to tell comes from an amazing, ramshackle, cosmic, wacky Buddhist text called the White Lotus Sutra. Quite amazing text. Do not read this text. I do not recommend you read this text because it is so... It's very difficult to get into without some guidance, and most of the translations are deeply unappealing, bordering on execrable, in my humble. They might be work for scholars, but they don't really work as a way to sort of connect with the beauty of what's being said. But what I would recommend you look at is this, which is Sangha Drama of Cosmic Enlightenment, which gives you an introduction to the White Lotus Sutra, or at least topics from the White Lotus Sutra. And in this, he does talk about this myth, this story of the return journey. The White Lotus Sutra is this amazing, wonderful, ramshackle, wacky text. And it contains lots of stories that illustrate and bring alive important truths about the spiritual life. And this story is one of them. Before I tell the story, though, a word of warning. In the story, the main character makes a return journey, but not from a barbarian land to his true homeland of sort of beauty and nobility. His return journey is from abject poverty to wealth and nobility, okay? The wealth and nobility he was born into. So in the story, wealth and riches represent spiritual wealth and riches, okay? It's not a story glorifying materialistic greed or saying there's anything wrong with a simple life. If we sort of relate to it in a political way, we're not going to get the message. We might as well just appreciate the story, that in the story, it's taken for granted that wealth and riches and splendid environment represent spiritual wealth, spiritual riches, spiritual splendour. And while the story sort of assumes that poverty is bad, it's meaning spiritual poverty, the story. So once upon a time, maybe in India, 2,000 years ago, there was a very, very rich father and his son. And while the son was still just a lad, still just a boy really, he got separated from his father, so that he couldn't find his way back home. He's just a lad, He's got no family anymore. He's lost, he's completely lost. He's got no trade or way of making a living. And this is India. He's got no caste, he's got no community that he belongs to. So he becomes one of the underclass. He becomes one of the abjectly poor underclass, one of the lowest of the low, one of the people who live on the edge, looking for scraps. And we do have to remember that this is India. This is India. Anyone who's been to India knows that what it means to be really poor in India. It's not like being really poor in Britain, where you might not be able to afford sort of flat screen TV. It doesn't mean that. It means being really poor. You see people as you travel around India who are filthy, who dressed in filthy rags because they don't have enough to be able to dress properly, who so filthy that you don't really want to go near them, actually. People who look matted, who sleep rough and live in hovels, obviously don't get enough to eat, who only do the filthiest jobs that nobody else will do. And you see that these people are looked down on. And that they themselves sometimes seem to have quite a low self-image, that they will beg but not look you in the eye, that sort of thing. So it's obviously not only that everybody else thinks they're low, if you like, but that this is, you know, there's not much self-esteem either. So that's what the son would have become. He would have become one of the lowest of the low. He would have been filthy. He would have been dirty. He would have been maybe a bit ashamed of himself, dressed in rags, living in a hovel. And maybe he would have picked up all sorts of rather coarse habits. So if everybody else looks down on you, and this erodes your sense of self-esteem, you start to think of yourself as low and inferior. You live in dirty places, you do lowly, unpleasant jobs, you're maybe dirty and badly dressed, unattractive even in your own eyes. You pick up all sorts of unattractive habits, and you develop a coarse way of speaking and behaving. And if you think that doesn't happen, well, I can tell you it does. It does. And I know that because, I know that from personal experience, actually, because when I was in my late teens, I fell out with my dad. And it's a bit like the return journey, really. I fell out with my dad, and I completely cut myself off from my family. Actually, my family had emigrated to Latin America. I came back to the UK, and I lived on my wits in London. Wasn't very worldly wise, so I became part of the underclass in London. getting money in any way I could. And for a while I was even homeless, okay, living on park benches. If you're ever homeless, the circle line's great. You just keep going around, it's warm. You can get a kip on the circle line. But you have to evade the ticket collectors. I was part of the underclass. I hobnobbed with that sort of people. I knew people who'd been in jail, etc., people like that. And I remember clearly that I started to think of myself as unattractive. And I developed habits that it took me years to shake off. For example, I got into the habit of swearing a lot. That's what people I was among did. They swore a lot. If I met myself, if I, as I am now, met myself as I was then, I would find the way I used to speak deeply offensive and grating. I would find it set up a nice horrendous atmosphere. I would recoil from the way I spoke. So that happens. And our hero of the story becomes part of the underclass. He becomes part of the underclass. He doesn't have very high self-esteem. He picks up all sorts of not very attractive habits and ways of being. And the longer he lived like that, the more he would think of himself like that, the more of those sorts of habits he would have picked up. And this goes on for decades. It goes on for decades, this way of life. The son lives like this for decades. So long that he can hardly remember ever being any different. He lives like this, lowly, dirty, until it becomes second nature to him. That's what he thinks he is. That's how he thinks of himself. And meanwhile, his father is immensely rich. His father is mourning for his son, and he's immensely rich. He lives in a huge palace in delightful gardens. Palace full of art treasures. Beautiful, beautiful things. Beautiful furniture. Beautiful things. He's got troops of servants. When he travels, he maybe travels in a cavalcade with elephants and gorgeous carriages and musicians. Gorgeously dressed retainers with banners. And when he's at home, he's surrounded by sort of comely ritual, if you like. There's a constant procession of rich, noble, aristocratic people coming to pay their respects. So he lives in a sort of royal court, surrounded by rich things, by beautiful music, by servants, by art treasures, by beauty everywhere, and the very richest and the most powerful people. He lives as though he was a king. And meanwhile, of course, the son is travelling from place to place, living in hovels, making money any way he can, doing the dirtiest of tasks, travelling around. And then, one day, in the son's wanderings, they bring him to the gates of his father's palace. Quite unknown to him, he comes to the gates of his father's palace. He's looking for any sort of menial work he can get. And he looks in at the gate and he sees some way off his father sitting on a beautiful, rich, throne-like chair with a rich canopy, surrounded by attendants and visiting nobility, come to pay him their respects. And he thinks, this must be a king. This is no place for me. I better get out of here. So, I mean, you might be able to imagine this. Perhaps you're really looking dirty. Perhaps you've been gardening. I don't know, but you're really filthy. You're really not at your best. And you walk past the gates of Buckingham Palace. And there's the Queen and the Duke and Charles and David Cameron and Barack Obama and I don't know who else. And you think, well, okay, they're not... I wouldn't really feel at home in that sort of garden party, you know. I mean, that's not the place for me. I'm off. This is no place for me. Let's get out of here. That's what he thinks. He thinks, well, perhaps I'm in trouble, actually. Perhaps I'm in trouble for even showing up here. But his father sees him, so he sort of legs it. He thinks, well, they're dangerous folk like this. So he legs it, but his father sees him and recognises him. His father sees him and recognises him. He says to two of his servants, "It's my son, get him!" No, he doesn't say my son. He says, "Get him, get that man!" And they sort of think he's done something wrong, so they leg after him. And he legs it off, and they tackle him. They rugby tackle him to the ground. And he wrestles, and they wrestle, and he gets knocked out. And the father thinks, that wasn't actually what I intended to happen, actually. But he thinks, he can see that his son's terrified. He can see that his son is terrified of him. So he sees that it's all gone wrong. And he says, okay, let him go. This isn't going to work. Let the guy go. The sutra says he sees that his son's disposition is inferior and that his own lordly position causes distress to his son. So he sees him, and even if he did say, "Hey, you're my son, I'm your father," he wouldn't really believe it. He wouldn't be able to accept it. He would still feel terribly out of place and uncomfortable and unhappy. So he lets his son go. But he finds out where he lives, and his father sends two men off to visit his son, to offer his son a job. And he thinks, well, there needs to be people he can relate to. So he thinks, well, there's no point in sending sort of rich, lordly retainers. So he sends two servants who the sutra describes as one-eyed, squat, common and uninspiring, of doleful and undignified appearance. So he sends these two people off, and they offer the son a job. They find him in his hovel, and they offer him a job, shifting piles of dirt. Not just ordinary dirt, actually, it's cleaning outhouses, shifting smelly filth, shifting dung heaps. The sort of job the lowest get in India. The sort of job that he relates to, actually, that he's been doing a lot of. But he offers him a reward that he can relate to as well. He says, "We'll give you double wages, double the wages you get for doing this anywhere else." So he's very pleased. He's delighted. The son's delighted. And from that day on, he works away in his father's estate, doing all sorts of the filthiest jobs. For ages, he spends time shoveling dirt out of the outhouses, doing all sorts of the dirtiest jobs. And the son moves into, for convenience sake, he moves into a straw hovel, sort of round the back of the palace somewhere. So often the father would observe the son, either working or going back to his hovel. He'd look out the windows of his gorgeous palace and he'd observe his son. And we're told that he felt amazed at how far his son had fallen. Amazed and very, very sorry for the state his son had come to. He felt huge pity, but he felt he couldn't do anything about it because he thought his son had become foolish and inferior, and there was nothing much he could do about it. So he develops a strategy. So the father develops a strategy for gradually changing his son's self-image, gradually refining his son, gradually strengthening his son, gradually increasing his self-esteem, gradually raising the level of his being. So the first step in the strategy is he sort of reduces himself to his son's level, so the level his son can relate to. So he pretends to be much poorer than he is, so that his son will accept him, won't be scared of him, so that he can get near his son. And a way to get him to work, to gradually get him used to the fact. So the first thing the father does is dress himself up in filthy clothes, smear himself with dirt, get himself a hod, I think he gets himself a hod, and goes and works along with his son. He's a sort of foreman. And initially he takes quite an interesting approach, because initially he tells his son off. He sort of says, get on with it, let's see you shift that dirt, you know. Don't be so lazy. Shift, come on, get you back into it. So initially he behaves like that. But this is really a device to get his son to accept him, if you like. He's behaving as expected. And when he's done that for a bit, and sort of his son's a bit used to him, he pretends to take a like to him. He pretends to taking a liking to him. He says, yeah, you're a good worker, you're honest. I like you, I like the cut of your jib, young man. You stick around here and work for me and I'll see you all right. So I'll put up your wages, I'll make sure you've got what you need. So he gradually ups his standard of living, so he's no longer so much in need, he's getting better food, he's working for a decent wage, he gets more and more self-esteem. And then in time he takes it further than that. In time he says, actually, I own this place. And you've become like a son to me. You've become like a son to me. Think of me as your father. Think of me as your father. So he sort of almost adopts him as a son. He even gives him a new name to mark the change in his status, which is maybe an interesting sort of nod in the direction of ordination. You get a new name when you become a different person. Although the father said this, although the father said, well, look, I own all this, and you're like a son to me, the son still thinks of himself as lowly. He still thinks of himself as a humble hireling, the text says. He can't really stop thinking of himself as just a humble hireling. He doesn't really think of himself as a rich man's son, although he's been, as it were, adopted. But he gets used to going into the palace. He starts to get used to going into the palace. Eventually he even starts to feel at home in the palace. Eventually he starts to, you know, he's mixing with people who behave in a much more comely manner. He starts to behave in a much more comely manner. He gets used to beautiful surroundings. But we're told he continues to live in his hovel. He continues to live in his hovel. It's as though he sort of lives on two levels. On the one hand, he's experiencing the beauty of the palace. On the other hand, he's still living in a hovel. And gradually, the father just gets him more and more used to beauty, to the palace, taking more and more responsibility. And this stage of the father's strategy goes on, we're told, for 20 years. For 20 years he does this. And then the father decides to up the stakes and push things. He says, look, I'm getting old, and I can't live forever. I'm going to need someone to look after my property when I'm gone. And I've already said you're like a son to me, so I'm going to make you my manager. I'm going to make you my steward. You're going to look after my property. You can look after my treasures and my artworks, keep track of my property, manage my business interests, my trading interests. How about it? So a few years ago, the son would never have felt himself able to do this. He wouldn't have felt himself able to mix with the people he'd been mixing with. He wouldn't have, he would have just run a mile from this. But now he's grown a lot. He's grown a lot in self-esteem. He's got a much better self-image, and he's got used to the way rich people behave, the nobility behave. So he's delighted to accept. This will be far better than shoveling heaps of dirt. So he's delighted to accept. So the son becomes the rich man's steward. He becomes his manager. He actually handles the beautiful jewels and the riches and the delightful artworks. He dresses well. He spends most of his time in the palace. He's mixing with the lords of the land. But far from being a humble hireling, he's now in a position of command, and he gets used to beauty and nobility. He gets used to precious things. But still, he doesn't think any of this is his. He still goes home each night to his hovel. it says, he still dwells outside, lodging in a hovel, for himself thinking of penurious things, saying, these things are not mine. And then, after the son has been the steward for some considerable time, and the father, it says, sees that his son despises his previous state of mind, sees that his son has gradually developed, the rich man makes the last move in his strategy. He calls all the nobles and aristocrats and rich and important people in the land to a meeting, and he calls his son as well. And at that meeting, he lets off a bombshell. At that meeting, he says, he makes a public announcement that this person here, who came to me as a shabby wretch, shabby underling, shabby worker, who's been working for me all these years, he's really my true son. I recognised him all along. He's not even my adopted son. He is my son. He is my true son. And that I herewith give him everything I own. I'm off. It's all his. The delightful gardens, the treasures, the wealth, the trading enterprises, the jewels, the artworks, everything, it's all his to do with as he goes. And of course the son is completely blown away by this. He's full of joy, and what for him is a completely unexpected bolt out of the blue. So he said, what the son says is, without me trying to get this wealth, without any effort on my part, all this wealth has come to me. Well, he seems to be slightly ignoring all the mucking out of the outhouses, but as far as he's concerned, it's just a windfall. He was never expecting this. So this is a story about how we can't become cut off from what's highest in us. Our inner riches and our treasure and our nobility, and how we need to gradually re-establish contact with our own riches, gradually coax our idea of ourselves to a higher level, gradually feel at home with our own magnificence, even, until in the end we become the owner of those riches. We become the person we could be. We've integrated our heights, the very highest parts of ourselves, as well as our depths. And that's not the work of a moment. According to the sutra, it took 20 years. And it's got various stages. I mean, looking at the sutra, we can sort of, looking at the story, we can pick out various stages. So in the first stage, the son is completely cut off from his own inner riches. He's roaming aimlessly, being part of the underclass, if you like, behaving in a coarse way, being poor and dirty has, we're told, become second nature to him. It's who he thinks he is. There's no doubt about it. He thinks he's like that. And I suppose the sutra is saying, well, in a way, that's what we might not, that's rather extreme, but compared to what we could be, we think of ourselves in a much more lowly manner than we're not giving ourselves the credit for who we really are. We've got far too low an idea of ourselves. And we've picked up, from being in samsara, we've picked up lots of rather unsavoury habits, rather unsavoury ways of being. We might think they're perfectly normal, but to a being from a higher level, they wouldn't look that great. And then the hero of the story gets a glimpse of his potential. He gets a glimpse of spiritual riches. So he finds himself at the gate of his father's palace. He sees his father in his glory. He sees the riches, etc., the beautiful gardens, and he finds it scary. He wants to run a mile. He thinks that's nothing to do with me. So instead of thinking, here lies my true happiness, he thinks, I'll stay away from this or I might need to change. And maybe that's our first response to coming across aspects of the spiritual life, is this is a bit scary. I don't want to change. I quite like being the sort of person I am right now. This will stop me enjoying my rather low habits, or what might seem to an enlightened being. I can't imagine living without being that way. So the father recognises him, but he runs away. But then, okay, so that's the second stage. Maybe we just start to come across something. We get inklings. Could be more. Oh, get me out of here. I don't want that. That's scary. But then, sometimes, if we're lucky, something in us shows us a way forward. Something gives us some specific spiritual work we can relate to. Shoveling dirt. Cleaning out houses. Maybe there's a lot of cleaning out houses to be done. We've got some spiritual work to do. But we're no longer a spiritual tramp. We're getting some spiritual wages now. Earning a decent wage, our self-esteem improves. And then again, if we're lucky, something in us, our heights, as it were, might sort of, as it were, come down to our level and befriend us, as the father did in the story. Stop being quite so scary, sort of mask its brilliance and come down and befriend us. Starts guiding us, starts giving us some more responsible jobs, coaching and gradually coaxing us in the direction of higher self-esteem, gradually coaxing us to drop our old low ways of being, our old low habits, gradually refining us. So in the story, the father gets the son going into the palace, doing more and more responsible jobs, getting used to beauty and riches, getting used to behaving in a way appropriate to those beautiful surroundings. He gets an experience of spiritual beauty. He starts to handle the father's gems and treasures. Eventually he becomes the father's steward. So he gradually becomes more and more like his father's son. He gradually gets used to the splendor, used to the riches. His self-esteem gradually rises. The level of responsibility he is willing to take gradually rises. But he still lives for a very long time on, as it were, two levels. So he has this experience of spiritual beauty. He's in touch with something. But he goes home at night to his hovel. He experiences spiritual beauty, spiritual magnificence, but in some ways he's still a poor man. And I mean, maybe many of us can identify with that. Maybe sometimes we're in touch with something and then we go back to our hovel and the usual ways that we behave. We live on two levels, and maybe that goes on for a very long time. In the sutra it goes on for 20 years. But eventually he becomes the steward, he gets a highly responsible job, he becomes at home with wealth and riches and nobility, and eventually he discovers it's all his. And it was all his all along. But he's gradually had to be coaxed to a state of being where he could actually see that it was all his, where it was a reality that it was all his, where it could be a reality rather than him just being made distinctly uncomfortable by it. So this is a story about connecting with and integrating our heights, making our spiritual riches, our nobility a part of who we are, and letting go of the sort of baser ways of being, the coarser ways of being that we all pick up from being citizens of samsara, from being sort of poverty-stricken beings in samsara, becoming the rich, noble being we could become. So, as I said before, it's nothing to do with external wealth. We can be rich and noble while living a very simple life. In fact, we're much more likely to be rich and noble living a simple life. It's got nothing to do with external riches. So the story tells us a story of how that happens, how we gradually get coaxed to that higher level. So what can we do to help that process along? Well, we need to start looking out for messages from or connectedness with whatever it is that the father represents in the story. The father in the story coaxes, we're the son, the father in the story coaxes us to a higher level. So in Buddhism, the word we use for the faculty . the word we use for the faculty through which we connect with whatever it is that the Father represents is called Shraddha. The Father is our Shraddha. It's this quality of Shraddha. Shraddha is often translated as faith, but that is got so many negative connotations in our culture that it's probably best to forget that and just use the word Shraddha. Faith often means belief in the unbelievable, but Shraddha doesn't mean belief. It means our connection with what is highest, our connection with what is highest in us, our connection with what is highest in the universe. Sangha Night, the founder of the Triratna Buddhist order, talks about it as the response of what is ultimate in us to what is ultimate in the universe. It's the sort of resonance that we feel in our heart when we come across spiritual values, when we come across things that really pull us towards them. So I'm told that the root of the word Shraddha is placing the heart on. We have Shraddha for what we place our heart on, the values that we admire, that we really want to live by, that really call to us. And our Shraddha is always trying to get through to us, a bit like the father was in the tale, always trying to get through to the son, always calling us towards a better, higher self and a better, higher future. So in this book that I recommended, The Drama of Cosmic Enlightenment, talking about this story, Sangha Night says the higher self never loses its awareness of us. Although we may forget the higher self never forgets us. It's always trying to get through to us. And it gives us that sort of sense of direction, sense that, come this way. It's almost like our future self calling, saying, come this way. No, not that way. No, over here, do this. It gives us that sense that certain things are really important, that we must do them, that certain things are right, certain things are important, certain values are beautiful and to be lived by. You may not know it, but Shraddha is what got you here. Shraddha sort of pulled you towards this. Otherwise, why be here? Why be here? So it's a small voice. It's our connection. It's our heart knowledge. It tells us that's right. That's who I could be. That's the direction to take. That's what I could serve instead of serving my own little wants and fears. That's who I really am. That's the direction. So the Father is this Shraddha. And if we listen to our Shraddha, if we listen to that, follow it, it will lead us on a journey back to who we really are. The messages may seem scary and unwelcome, as they did for our hero when he first saw his father. He was terrified. His father had to sort of scale himself down. If we get a full image of what's possible, we might just find it very scary. The messages might ask us to shovel some dirt. They may ask us to do scary things, taking on responsibilities beyond our present idea of ourselves, beyond our idea of who we are, who we could be. But we need to pay attention to it. So Shraddha is what we place our heart on. It's our response to the values that we place our heart on, the symbols, teachings, and people that represent those values. Sangha Night says, it's the real living response of the whole being to something which we intuitively perceive as greater and higher and nobler and more sublime than ourselves as we are now. So Shraddha is our response to the truth and the ideals that we admire and love, that we wish to live by, that we want to put at the centre of our lives, if we want to live really meaningful lives. If we want to live according to what's truest and highest in us. It's the faculty by which we perceive spiritual value and beauty, and which draws us towards it, the response of what's ultimate to us, in us, to what's ultimate in the universe. And just to say a little bit, I'm running out of time slightly, but just to say a little bit about Shraddha. There's usually said to be three aspects of Shraddha. There's what's called confident Shraddha, confident faith sometimes, which is the We know certain things to be true. It's the head aspect of Shraddha. We know, we have a deep sense of rightness, that certain Dharma teachings, for example, are true, that certain practices work. We know that with our head. And clear thinking is important. It doesn't mean, as somebody said the other day, believing in fairies. You know, Shraddha doesn't mean believing in fairies, although it's intuitive. We need our intellect. We need our intellect. Shraddha goes beyond the intellect, but we need our intellect. So, first one is confident faith, with the head. The second is lucid faith, the feeling heart aspect of Shraddha. It's our emotional response of love and admiration for positive values, for positive qualities, for people who represent those qualities, positive qualities. It's our response to spiritual beauty, and it's got a lot to do, the beauty of higher values, the beauty of character in people or higher beings. It's strongly related to our aesthetic sense. And then there's longing faith. So, confident faith, lucid faith, and longing faith. And longing faith is, if you like, the volitional gut aspect of Shraddha. The aspect that's to do with the will, that pulls us, if you like, towards the qualities we admire, that pulls us to become more the person we could be. So we need those three aspects of Shraddha. Okay, so Shraddha is the father in the story. How do we open up to it, and how do we listen to it, just as a final sort of consideration? I think the first thing is, don't undermine Shraddha. Don't undermine it and dismiss it. We can get the idea that only the only things we can know are the things we can weigh or measure or see or prove logically. We can get that idea. But in the spiritual area, that is not true. That is simply not true. We don't want to abandon the intellect and believe what's unbelievable, but we have a sort of heart knowledge, what I'm going to call heart knowledge, about what is admirable and desirable and beautiful and even true. And in the spiritual area, that is the only sort of knowledge we have. You can't prove logically that metta is better than hatred. In fact, I have met Darwinists. I met somebody who regarded themselves as a Darwinist, got a completely internally logical approach to what he saw life was about, who would argue that it is right to look after oneself and exploit the weaker. After all, it's about the survival of the fittest. And there's no way I can, all I can say is you're wrong, because I know that with my heart, but you can't argue it logically. You get all sorts of things like that, where things logically might make sense, which we know that that's wrong with our heart knowledge. Why should we doubt what we know with our whole being? Because it can't be logically proven, or because you can't weigh it. So accept the fact that we know certain things in a way that can't be weighed, can't be measured, can't be proved logically. We just know them. We would have to sort of almost commit spiritual suicide not to admit that we know them. So don't undermine Shraddha. Notice it. Pay attention to it. It's the voice of our heights. Don't undermine it by a wrong use of the head. Secondly, we need to do the things that give us more Shraddha. So people often observe that they're much more on Shraddha, in touch with Shraddha when they're on retreat, for example. Buddhists tend to go on retreat, doing lots of meditation, having a very structured life, away from a lot of the usual distractions, around positive people, in a nice environment, talking about the Dharma, and lo and behold, our Shraddha increases. Shraddhas are like a small, quiet voice, and we often can't hear it because it's so drowned out by all our distractions that we involve ourselves with, and all the sort of churned up thoughts, our cravings, our fears, and our constant distraction. If we allow our mind to focus and settle, it becomes much more obvious that still small voice can actually talk to us. So it turns out that many of the things we do as spiritual practice are precisely the way we put our heart and mind more in touch with Shraddha, precisely the way we listen more to the Father in the story. One of them is listen, read, study, talk about the Dharma. Something about it connects us with something higher. Spend time with the Sangha. Shraddha grows when shared. It's undermined by being around people who are cynical. Meditate. When the mind calms down, when we do the Metta Bhavana, we can hear the voice of our Shraddha more clearly. When we do the Metta Bhavana, we're in touch with positive emotion. Shraddha is an aspect of positive emotion. Shraddha is what happens when Metta meets something higher than ourselves that we love. Cultivating Metta puts us in touch with Shraddha. And meditation can also give us a direct experience of spiritual riches. We can experience really delightful, enriched states of mind in meditation. If you haven't had experience of that, don't worry. Don't get attached to it. Don't think you're doing it wrong. But believe me, that potential is there. And if you keep going, you are very likely to experience it. You are very likely to find yourself experiencing mental states where you think, I didn't know it was possible to be like this. I didn't know it was possible to feel like this. So meditate, do puja, do whatever puts us in touch with beauty, spend time in nature, listen to music, read good poetry, look at great art. All those things. There's a really strong connection between Shraddha and the appreciation of beauty, because in a sense it is the appreciation of spiritual beauty. And finally, act on it. So act on Shraddha. If we don't act on the voice of our depths, the voice of our heights rather, there is, I'm afraid, a real possibility that it will apparently give up on us. And that would be the most terrible tragedy imaginable. Leaving us in a colourless, meaningless world. Actually, our Shraddha never gives up on us, but we can cut ourselves off from it in a way that means it might as well not be there. The son in the story could have slapped his father around the face and legged it. We can cut ourselves off, and that would be terrible. We need to act on our Shraddha. We need to listen to what it's telling us. So don't undermine it with the wrong use of the head. Listen to the heart and do the things that encourage it and act on it. So Shraddha is like the father in the story, always trying to get through to us, always trying to guide us towards becoming the rich and noble being we could be. It's the voice of our future self calling us, our potential, saying this way, this way. And Shraddha is something we can cultivate. In fact, cultivating Shraddha is probably the most important aspect of the spiritual life. It's why we do a lot of the things that we do, I reckon. Shraddha is like a thread. It's like a thread connecting us to our heights, to the heights. It's our connection with what's highest in the universe and our connection with what's highest in us. And if we hang on to that thread, then the heights will reel us in. As the father in the story sort of reeled the son in, a bit like a fisherman playing a very heavy fish. The father sort of carefully reeled the son in. So if we hang on to the thread, if we hang on to the hook, the heights will reel us in. Our own heights will reel us in. And while at the moment we might think about this is me integrating my heights, what's highest in me making my heights an integral part of myself, what actually happens is that the heights reel us in, and what is highest in the universe integrates us. We become part of what is highest. We become part of Buddhahood, part of enlightenment. So that all the treasures and the riches of enlightenment really are ours, except that we don't exist anymore.